You could say that in the last 33 years, I've been terribly beating around the bush. You see, touring India on the sides, going to Mumbai, to Chennai, to Calcutta, all these peripheral places, and somehow missing the center. Closest I've ever been to the center is in Sanchi, but no, Nagpur I missed so far. So I've just visited the what is it called, Dr. Hedgewar Smarak Samiti or something, and well, it's quite impressive. Initially, when you go in, the gate where the policemen are, it looks like just one of the many big, impressive buildings in India. But then when you go to the Hedgewar Samadhi, that's a special place. It's really very well done as a monument. And so I understand that the ashes of both Hedgewar and Guru Golwalkar are there. And so as a monument, it is just well done. I mean, I've already noticed when you deal with RSS people, whatever you think of their ideology, but at any rate, they are getting things done. You see, on RSS people you get caught. That much I definitely noticed. So the secret is Sangathan, self-organization. Around the time that Hedgewar founded the RSS, the term Sanghatan was, I won't say popular, but was more often used by people having the same concerns about the future of Hindu society. Hindu Sangathan, Savior of the Dying Race, was a book at that time written by Swami Shraddhananda, one of the leading lights of the Arya Samaj, the reformist movement, and also one of the founders of the Hindu Mahasabha. And so he too thought that part of the problem for Hindus was their lack of organization, and so he expected a lot from organization, together with another principle which he didn't have to enunciate anew, because it was very much present at the time, thanks to the Arya Samaj, namely Shuddhi. Shuddhi Karam, purification, means effectively the reconversion of converted Christians and Muslims to their ancestral dharma. That has gone a bit out of business, especially because in the subsequent decades, Mahatma Gandhi propagated the idea that all religions say the same thing, in which case you don't really need to convert from anything to anything. You see, in this idea, when Aurangzeb or Mahmud Ghaznavi did all their killing and destruction, it was not because they had anything against Hinduism. Because Hinduism was just a variation of Islam. Okay, so then the whole confusion set in, which has only worsened since then. And so now from many different quarters, you hear stories like all religions say the same thing. And so why don't you stop fussing about the love jihad and other conversion strategies by the enemy, since Hindus becoming Christian or Muslim, so it's all the same anyway. So Shri has gone a bit out of business. It has been revived recently thanks to the Vishwa Hindu Parishad in the form of Ghar Wapasi, homecoming. So that's something I greatly appreciate. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad is doing great work still. But since we're going to talk about the future of Hindu society, that may not be true of all members of the Hindu movement. You see, some of them have become pretty dysfunctional. Like there still exists a Hindu Mahasabha. It still has some headquarter building in Delhi, very worn down and so on, but they never die. As Giriraj Jain, the former the late Giriraj Jain, the former editor of the Times of India, used to say, nothing ever dies in India. So, you see, of course, organizations that have long gone out of active business still survive. Okay? But so they're not really there anymore. This perhaps counts for some more controversial movements, like I remember in the 90s, the Bajrang Dal was very prominent. It was a name mentioned in the context of the demolition of the Babri Masjid. Today, apparently, it's dormant. Shri Kantalagiri, a famous scholar who lives in Mumbai, pointed out to me how in one heavily jihadi district, some measure of control was kept by the presence of the Bajrang Dal, and now their office is closed. And so it has been very much sidelined by some people in the Hindu movement. And so here I'll start being controversial. The VJP was founded as the political wing of the RSS. Quite explicitly, you can safely say that it's not something that is only being claimed by Christophe Jaffrelot and other anti-Hindu scholars. It's simply true that after the Hindu Mahasabha became unviable because of its association with the Mahatma Gandhi murder, that then Guru Gobakar okayed the creation of an RSS-affiliated political party, and the Hindu Mahasabha leader Shyam Prasad Mukherjee left the Hindu Mahasabha because it had become unviable, because he didn't want to be associated with this murder. And then he became the leader of the new party, the Bhartiya Sangh. Now, that was a very good initiative, and nothing against Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. A month ago, I went in Kolkata to the Shyam Prasad Mukherjee Research Institute, led by his grandniece. But she too said that, you know, the BJP has veered away quite far from the line taken by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. So that was a Hindu party. I just heard a song here about Hindu Rashtra. That was a party wedded to the ideal of a Hindu state. But after Shyam Prasad Mukherjee died in 1953, it was downhill all the way. And at least for the Hindu contents of the party. I am often asked, because I wrote a book on it, what I think of the Mahatma murder. So it was a great mistake. I see on Twitter and some humorous Hindus who are all for Nathuram Godse who think that he should get the statues, that become possible the day all the Mahatma Gandhi statues are taken away, and stuff like that. Or even Balthake said something like that. In the future, there will be statues for Godse instead of for Gandhi. Now, I am not so sure about that. I can perfectly understand that someone who did not engineer the partition, but at least condoned it, and was the only person in India who could have prevented it, namely by using his famous blackmail technique of fasting unto death, which he used 17 times without ever dying. And so ultimately a bullet was needed to get him to the other world, whereas in this case, you see, he really could have usefully fasted unto death, namely to prevent Jinnah from partitioning India. So he didn't, and I understand that people were angry with him. Like I interviewed one of the conspirators, so one of the accomplices of Nathuram Godse, Madan Lal Pahwa. In the 90s, he had a little shop in Mumbai. And so he told me his story, which is quite heart-rending. He was living somewhere in what was to become Pakistan, in a family of 22. And so they said, this is becoming untenable here, we're going to the Indian territory. And near where they lived, there was a train station. So they were going to take the train to India. Now, his old aunt, she didn't like all these modern technologies. She wanted to go on foot or on bullock cart or some traditional means all the way to India. And to him, as a young lad, was assigned the duty of accompanying her. So that's 2 of them more or less on foot, and 20 of them going by train. And so they agreed to meet at some train station on the Indian side of the border. And they went there, and yes, they had arrived by train, only they were not alive anymore. All the people in the train had been massacred. So his entire family had been massacred. And there I can understand that he was so angry with Gandhi that he thought this man must die. Yet, you see, the conspirators had better held their horses a little bit and thought twice before doing what their boiling blood was telling them to do. Because they smashed their windows like practically no one has ever done in history before or since. You see, after the partition, the Hindu movement was going strong. You see, Congress had failed to prevent partition, had become an accomplice to it, had also not held back the hand of Lord Mountbatten, who was of course not the creator of partition, but who made partition much, much worse than it should have been, like by hurrying things. It was planned for summer of 48, and he made it happen on 15th of August 47, which was the second anniversary of the high point in his life, which was the Japanese capitulation in the hands of Douglas MacArthur for the Americans and himself for the British Empire. So he wanted to celebrate that by putting the independence of India on the same date. So the whole partition thing was unprepared, was hurried, not organized. And secondly, he refused to instrumentalize the British presence, military presence that was still there in India. You see, many soldiers who were not particularly here to suppress India, but who were here as former soldiers that had to fight the Japanese. So they were all brought back from China, from Burma and so on to India before they would be demobilized and sent back to England. Now, if they had been used, the partition would have been much, much, much less bloody because, you see, most of the partition was done by amateurs. You know, all the people that I've interviewed who were refugees told me, you see, we were assured by our neighbors, okay, nothing is going to happen here. We're going to prevent anything from happening. And those were the neighbors that they had been, you know, they had been in the playground with them 40 years ago, and they had, you know, done business with them and so on. They were good friends, and yet, when the trouble started, they were the first to kill the Hindus. But they were amateurs. You see, if they had seen some column of British soldiers walking in their street, they would have thought twice. Probably the British soldiers would not even have to do any fighting. Just being present was mostly enough to keep order and to ensure an orderly transfer of population. This he did not do. And so Churchill, who used to patronize him, who used to bring him to power when in fact he didn't merit it, he hadn't achieved much, and so he was given this enormously important position of Viceroy of India, and he blew it completely. So Churchill refused to remain his friend after that. So you see, he performed very badly, and the role of Congress is that it totally supported him. You see, Nehru, largely for personal reasons. Nehru and Mountbatten had this in common, that both were completely vainglorious. You know, this is what explains the misery caused by Mountbatten, and it is also what explains all the Himalayan blunders committed by Nehru. Anyway, so because of all this misbehavior by Gandhi, by Nehru, the Hindu movement really had the wind in the sails. By, let's say, 1960, they could have replaced Congress as the party in power. And yet that didn't happen because of the murder. The murder threw the Hindu movement 50 years back. It greatly weakened the Hindu movement. The whole Hindu movement, all the activists were arrested, all the books and so on were confiscated. And the movement had to begin from scratch, you know, after the imprisonment and so on was over. So it was very much weakened, and very many people who would have joined it now decided not to do so. So the movement became much weaker than it should have been. Of course, gradually then it restarted, and Golwalkar was very creative in starting all these front organizations, a student wing, a labor wing, cultural wing, and so on, a women's organization, and so on. But nevertheless, you see, if the murder had not happened, this would have advanced to a much larger degree. But that was not the worst of it. The movement especially became much less Hindu than it could have been. You see, originally it was directed to Hindu Rashtra, all kinds of Hindu goals. It very much declared itself a Hindu movement. There was no doubt about it at all that this was a Hindu movement. Yet, look at the history of Jalsang. After 1953, it became more and more and more a secularist party. In 1964, the party leader, Bhartiya, gave his speeches that were bundled into a booklet called Integral Humanism. Now, there's nothing wrong with integral humanism. Indeed, I'd say that in some respects the booklet was a masterstroke. You know, there's a much abused word these days, but that really was. You see, who could be against integral humanism? Yeah, isn't that a nice thing? You know, is Rahul Gandhi going to say, there's about integral humanism. I'm against integral. I'm against humanism. He's not going to say that. You see, it sounds so nice, integral humanism. Of course, integral humanism. That we hadn't thought about this earlier. Right? Indeed, it's so good, you know, you can see that it must be very good because all the enemies of the Hindu movement absolutely carefully refuse to mention it. 99% of the scholarly publications on the Hindu movement. I don't even speak about the pamphlets by the communists or the Congress or something. No. You see, publications that claim to be objective and scientific. 99% talk about the BJP without mentioning the official party ideology. Can you imagine a book on the Chinese Communist Party that carefully avoids using the word communism? That is unthinkable, and yet in India regarding the Hindu movement, this is a done thing. Now, in general, I'll speak in favor of integral humanism, but there is one little thing wrong with it. You know, it's not very wrong, but it is that the term Hindu doesn't appear in it. Now, the good thing is that integral humanism is more or less the modern translation of the concept of dharma. And of course, you see, anciently people didn't call themselves integral humanists. They spoke of dharma, but in more or less the same context. They also didn't call themselves Hindu. You see, Chanakya never spoke about Hindu Rashtra or about anything Hindu, because that term didn't exist yet, at least not in India. So in itself, that's okay. However, if people like Nanaji Deshmukh or Atal Bihari Vajpayee welcome this, it is not because they were so enamored of integral humanism, it is especially because integral humanism didn't sound Hindu. You see, they wanted to get rid of the association of the Bhartiya Jansang with Hinduism. Already they had the name right. It was not called Hindu Jansang, it was called Bhartiya Jansang. That was already a good thing for them. But so in the term integral humanism, there's nothing Hindu anymore. They continued and with their leftward drift, and they started talking about Gandhian socialism. In the 60s, 70s, socialism was very voguish, like a British conservative politician said at the time. We're all socialists now. See, everybody who didn't want to be an absolutely reactionary, old fart, declared himself socialist. So in a sense it's understandable, but in a sense it illustrates perfectly what the weakness is. You see, the BJS at that time already had less and less and less of an ideological backbone, rather than saying, okay, we are going to give the Hindu alternative. if any issue arose, you see, they could say, okay, you say this, you say that, we're going to say what Hinduism says. No, they didn't do that. They simply drifted with the wind. You see, like a flag that, moves in the direction where the wind comes from, or where the wind is going, rather. So that was already visible there. It's something, you see, the idea came to my mind when I saw, I did a PhD on the Hindu movement. So in the 90s, I studied the BJP writings, and I noticed, and you see, I saw later on, gradually, that it was a very general phenomenon, but the first time I noticed it was, you see, there was some document about women's rights and the women's movement and so on, and it had this American buzzword, empowerment. So it didn't try to give some traditional Hindu alternative. It didn't ask Madhu Kishwar, what Sanskrit word can we put here? No, it just took over the American thing. And, that's a very common phenomenon till today. And so in the 60s it was also already there by embracing the term socialism. There is an idea that the BJP is the right-wing pole in Indian political landscape. Now, that was not true at the time. The right-wing pole at that time was the Swatantra Party, which for a while was the second largest party after Congress, bigger than the Jansa. And so that was like a pro-Western party, a distinctly anti-communist party. Whereas if you read BJS texts from those days, you see that in the Cold War they were wishy-washy. And, it is good that India steers an independent course. But you see, we all know that at that time, non-aligned meant sort of pro-Soviet, without being an official Soviet satellite. You see, it meant being anti-American. And I don't think that is the independent, non-aligned course that India, and specifically the Hindu movement, should have been pursuing. You see, they were very inflected towards this not communist, but pro-communist, anti-American current. So the real right-wing party at that time was the Swatantra Party, founded by Raja Gopalachari and by Minu Masami, and supported by Ram Swarup and Sitaram Goel, who stood as a candidate in 1957 for the then new Swatantra Party from Khajuraho. Okay, so then came the emergency, and there, of course, the Jansang did the correct thing, which was to oppose the emergency. They proved that they were a pro-democratic party, contrary to what all the scholars say. And then they merged into the Janata Party. So did the Swatantra Party, or incidentally, you can also see something about where they stood when you see how they fared. You see, Indira Gandhi did nothing against the Jansang because they were not a threat to her. She acted against the Swatantra Party. The Swatantra Party had the support of most of the princes, of the Maharajas, who then had some distinct power left. You see, that was during the signing of the instrument of accession, the princes handed over sovereignty to the Indian Republic, but they got certain privileges in return. So Indira Gandhi broke her word, and so she took those privileges away. Why? Not because she cared much about, this totally unimportant leftover of feudalism or so. That was not her concern. What was her concern was that the Swatantra Party was supported by the princes and was the opposition that she had to take into account. So to punish the Swatantra Party, she punished the Maharajas. See, and so she did nothing like that with the Jansang because the Jansang was unimportant at that time. Okay, so it merged into the Janata Party. Apparently, as Vajpayee related afterwards, they swore an oath that they would stand by the Janata Party forever, that they did away with their separate identity. So they joined the Janata Party where, Vajpayee himself fared very well. He became the foreign minister, the highest in rank of the former Jansang, where in fact the Soviet members of government whom he visited gave a very positive appraisal of him afterwards. They didn't see him as a conservative or a rightist or anything. They saw him as one of them. Okay. In spite of all this collaboration, nevertheless, the Janata Party was sufficiently against the former Jansang or against the explicitly RSS-oriented elements that they forced the RSS people to choose. And this was the double membership issue. Either you're a member of the Janata Party or a member of the RSS. This is a typical pattern that keeps on repeating. The Hindu movement makes all kinds of compromises with their enemy, but the enemy does not compromise with them. The enemy keeps treating them as enemies. And so this is the story with Christians and Muslims and so on till today. Like till today, you see Modi may make all kinds of gestures towards the Muslim constituency. They will never vote for him. They keep treating him as the enemy. All the media and the India watchers and the ideologists and so on, they keep treating Modi in the most hostile terms, whatever he does. Okay? So that was there already in evidence. Then in 1980, the party was reconstituted as the Bhartiya Janata Party. The name remained essentially the same, Sangha or party. Let's say that party is a more Western term. So in that sense, they were compromising a little bit more. And Bhartiya was, of course, remained the alternative for Hindu. So it was safely not Hindu, but Bhartiya. But all the Hindu elements that were still present in the manifestos of the Jansang now disappeared. There was no talk anymore about Hindu Rashtra. When you say to the BJP, oh, but you didn't fulfill your promises, we expected you to do something for Hindus, and you didn't. They will say, well, we never promised anything. Look at our manifesto, nothing Hindu in there. Look, we won the elections in 2019, not promising anything Hindu. We promised Vichar, and that's what we did. And I have to admit that is indeed what they did. In that respect, they achieved a lot. But so, from then on, they were not a pro-Hindu party anymore, not officially. Many people who joined it still wanted to do something for Hinduism and thought that this was the best way to do it. But the party leadership was less and less and less and less Hindu. Like you look at, for instance, the evolution of L.K. Advani, who around 1990, when with his Rath Yatra, counted as the fanatical Hindu leader. But when the Babri Masjid was demolished, he broke down in tears right there. And in his autobiography, he writes all kinds of anti-demolition stuff. It's the blackest day of my life. And he distances himself from Hindu demands. He identifies with the secularist analysis. Like for instance, he says, oh, I don't want, Hindu majoritarianism. what is this thing Hindu majoritarianism? That's totally an invention of the left. The Hindu majority has never done anything to oppress the minorities, not in the Indian Republic and not in all the centuries before that. You see, in America, for example, you can understand that there is some, reservations or what they call affirmative action over there in favor of blacks, because the blacks have historically suffered injustice in the form of slavery. Now, whether these reservations are the good answer to that, that's open for discussion. I doubt it, but I'm not sure, and anyway, it's not for me to take the decisions there. But the historical fact that they suffered slavery, now that's simply a fact. You can't get around that. Now, is there such a fact in India to accuse the Hindus of majoritarianism or to favor the minorities and to give them any kind of compensation? Well, though there has never ever been a time when the Hindu majority oppressed the minorities. There has never been a time when it was an advantage to be a Hindu and a disadvantage to be a Muslim or Christian. Under Muslim rule, you had situations like, for instance, okay, you have a quarrel with your neighbor, the apples from your tree are falling in his garden, or so, whatever conflict you had. Okay, you both go to court to fight it out. And what turns out to be the case, that whoever is the first to convert to Islam automatically wins the court case, right? Or for example, most of the converts to Islam were members of the urban artisanal castes. Craftsmen, plumbers and whatever you have. And so, for the sake of employment, you see, Muslims had much better chance in the newly rich, upper class to be employed there than Hindus had. So many of them converted just for the advantages of being a Muslim brought. Same thing in the Portuguese areas of Christianity. So there is no time at all during these two colonizations, or before or after, when it was a disadvantage to be a minority person. So there is no case for compensation towards the minorities. Yet, you see, in Advani's autobiography, he's unclear about that, to say the least. And so in the present government, that is even more explicitly the case, particularly under the guidance of the minorities minister, Naqvi. All kinds of freebies are given to the Muslim community. Colleges are founded especially for Muslims. All kinds of scholarships are given to thousands of Muslims. And that are earmarked, especially for Muslims. And then you have these Modi Bhakts who are saying, oh no, this is a masterstroke. These Muslims will vote for him. And you say, oh yeah, there are many girls getting scholarships and they will be emancipated and they will be a problem for Islam and so on. Well, I'm afraid. And anyway, you see, I'm all in favor of education for Muslim girls and so on. You don't need reservations for that. The Muslim community, Muslims as Muslims, do not have to be compensated for anything at all. In a secular state, there are no minorities. You see, if you start talking about the minorities, like Advani does, you're already far away from secularism. You see, let alone Hinduism. You see, I don't want the BJP to be a Hindu party. I'll already be very satisfied if they are a secular party, if they advocate secularism. Well, what does secularism mean? It means totally abolishing the notion of minority. You see, nowadays in government documents, I read that, you see, let's say students in school are classified as Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, and non-minorities.
Yes.
That's what Hindus now have been reduced to. You see, in a secular state, and I come from a secular state, okay, there is no mention of any religion at all in the Constitution. Okay, there are citizens, and this much is said explicitly in the Constitution: all citizens are equal before the law. This was against, I mean, this Constitution is from 1831. At that time, the nobility still had a lot of privileges and so on. They were treated far more favorably in a court case, for example. So that was all abolished. From now on, everybody equal, right? Now, you see in India, there is also such a phrase in the Constitution. However, also in the Constitution, you have a lot of talk about minorities. And you see, Muslims and so on are explicitly mentioned and are explicitly given a number of privileges that are withheld from Hindus, which explains why a number of Hindu groups hurry towards the exit, claim to be non-Hindus, like Jains who fall under Hindu law. You see, insist on a minority status, not to have a separate law system, but at least to have the privileges that minorities get. You see, Hindu schools can be nationalized by the state, can be taken over. On them, a certain curriculum is imposed, which is not allowed to contain any Hindu education. Whereas minority schools don't have this. On them is imposed the burden of the Right to Education Act, of paying for 25% non-paying students, from which the Muslim and Christian schools and all minority schools are exempt. So that hundreds of Hindu schools have closed down, and some that I personally know are deeply in debt. So you see, all this is continuing, and this is all based on a very anti-secular notion of minority. You see, if you do a description, a statistical description of the Indian population, then yes, of course, you're going to run into figures below 50%, so that's a minority, and one above 50% is a majority. So that's descriptively okay. That's understandable, but prescriptively, normatively, these terms should just not exist. The Constitution should have absolutely no place for them if India is to be a secular state. So I don't mind if the BJP doesn't want to be called Hindu, but at least let them be secular. And I don't mean mouthing secularist platitudes, Nehruvian platitudes, which really mean anti-Hindu. No, you see, let them be really secular. It's very, very, very simple. So, you see, you can abolish from the Constitution those passages that discriminate against the majority. It's only a few, and you can easily abolish them, and you don't hurt anyone, because you don't do anything to the minorities. You only change something for the majority, right? So it's not a suicide mission like what they nowadays talk about of starting a common civil code. I am in favor of a common civil code. In Belgium, of course, there is a common civil code. Nobody even considers doing anything against it. But in India, a common civil code, though desirable in itself, right now is very risky. You see, when the BJP piloted the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, they did so with great difficulty and a little bit of agitation, in which not even any Muslim was killed. A few Hindus were killed, yes, but no Muslim was killed. And and yet the BJP already crawled back and you see, didn't do anything to implement this Citizenship Amendment Act. Before the Supreme Court, every time the issue come up, they plead for postponement, and one more postponement, and one more postponement. Well, so if that is already too much for them, you don't want to know what they're going to be up against if they start getting serious about the Common Civil Code. You see, that is against Islamic law. You see, in Islam, their law system, their Sharia, is fundamental. The Christians have no separate law system. You know, when you speak in India about Christian law, it's a few remnants from the Portuguese, but that's not essential, and Christians won't mind if this changes. Whereas for Muslims, it is absolutely essential. So they are going to protest. You're going to have riots from every mosque. And then the BJP will crawl back, you know. They'll give up. And then they'll use that experience to justify not doing anything about serious Hindu demands, like abolishing the anti-Hindu discriminations in education and in temple ownership. You see, these appropriating Hindu temples, that only happens with Hindu temples, not with mosques or churches. And you see the explanation that they're always against corruption. Now, as if there is no corruption in churches and mosques. And secondly, against corruption you can do things. You see, in the business world, they have to live with state controls, with inspections, with fiscal, civil servants who draw by and check their books and so on. So you can do this with temples also. You can enforce a certain discipline so that there's no corruption. That's nothing. Any state can do that. And so that's a totally false excuse. The least that the BJP could do without changing any law at all is just to relinquish state control over temples in Rajasthan, in Uttarakhand, and wherever they have state control, wherever they themselves have installed state controls over temples. It's only in Tamil Nadu, where they have no chance at all of ever coming to power, that they now start clamoring against state controls over temples. Right? But the education issue is even more important than temples. You see, these temples are not going to run away. They will be standing there. If in 10 years' time you have an occasion to do something about it, it's still possible. By contrast, education is an enormously consequential issue. In the past, people became Hindu because they drank Hinduism. It was everywhere. It was in their household. I mean, the education they received from their parents and from their neighbors and so on, all the influences went in the same direction. Today, this is not the case anymore at all. They watch Bollywood, they listen to American music, and so on, and to all the anti-Hindu propaganda that is fed to them in school. And so to go against that, the very least you should have in your hands is the education system. So you absolutely, if you want Hinduism to have a future, you absolutely have to gain control over your education. This is absolutely the most pressing issue. And so a government that isn't doing anything about the anti-Hindu discrimination in education, well, I don't know what I would call that government. Maybe anti-Hindu. So you see that those are a few practical thoughts I have about the future of Hinduism. If you want my estimate about the demographic evolution, I mean, everybody asks me about that, And you see, in Europe, you have a really fast Islamization going on. And so the percentage of Muslims in France, for instance, is already approaching the percentage that you have in India. And the attitude of the politicians is also starting to resemble that what you have in India. But in France, perhaps the least, because they have a strong tradition of militant secularism. But so, for Europe, you can really say, okay, there will be a Muslim majority before the end of the century. This you can also say about India. Maybe it'll be a bit slower in India, but essentially it's the same. You see, the western subcontinent of the Eurasian landmass and the southern subcontinent, which is here, are essentially in the same boat, right? With the difference that Europe really is a union of states. It started with states, striking some confederal agreement, whereas India, contrary to what Rahul Gandhi now says, never was a union of states. It was not a number of independent states coming together to throw in their destiny and become a common republic. That's not at all how that's historically incorrect. The first line of the constitution is a historical mistake. India is not a union of states. Okay? But anyway, the point I want to make is, you see, the European Union and the Indian Union, to use that term, are essentially in the same boat, namely in the sense that they are going to be Islamized. Yes. You see, I see on Twitter some quotes being quoted once in a while from Pervez Musharraf, the former president of Pakistan. And I don't know if he has really said it, but he certainly thinks it. Namely, you see, it's a reaction to the fact that Pakistan is losing all the wars against India. It has lost all the military wars, but now it is also losing on the economic front. You see, India is going from strength to strength, and Pakistan is going down, down, down. It survives as a colony of China nowadays. In terms of cultural life and so on, India is a center. Everybody wants to go to India, wants to have an appearance in India. Nobody cares about Pakistan. The Pakistani restaurant owners in the West or anywhere in the world claim that theirs is an Indian restaurant. Because nobody would go to a Pakistani restaurant, but an Indian restaurant, that's different. On every front, Pakistan is losing against India. Now Musharraf says, okay, this I can't deny. India is winning all the wars, not only the military wars, is winning all confrontations with Pakistan. But there is one that they can't win. They cannot prevent becoming Pakistan. Because simply for demographic reasons, the Muslims are going to take over. At least, that's what Musharraf says. And so he has a point. However, personally, I don't think so, because of an evolution that no Hindu has any merit in, except maybe Sitaram Goel. But that is very much there. It is the fact that there is now more and more apostasy from Islam. 2 weeks ago I was in Kerala. It's impressive, you see there you have thousands of ex-Muslims, practically all young people. And you see now it's relatively easy for them. They don't have to bring books home that their father can find in which Islam is criticized. You see, they simply have their smartphone and they go to all the forbidden websites, and then they go out of those again so that nobody finds out. And so they can learn about everything that's wrong with Islam and then finally break with Islam. This happens. It happens in the Arab countries. It happens in the West also. In India, perhaps less than in the Arab countries, because in the Arab countries, they have no enemy. The society is fully Islamic, there may be a few percent of minorities, but they're not important. And so there, it happens on a fairly large scale, like this Protestant Research Institute in America, the Pew Institute. They have, for a few decades already, they have carried out opinion polls among the Arabs, and very professional. I mean, it's not they're going to be stupid, walking, with an American accent and an American demeanor and say, okay, what do you think? And then, of course, these Arabs are going to give exactly the answer that they think an American would like to hear. Okay, that's not it. This is very well done, and of course, questions are in Arabic by Arabs and so on. So, what they see is that an increasing percentage every 10 years says openly that they're not Muslim anymore. And so that's also the evolution I see in Belgium. Like a number of members of the Belgian parliament are ex-Muslims, particularly women. And are actively supporting the anti-Islamic causes in their home country. One is from, I think, Burkina Faso, one is from Iran, and one is from Turkey, and one is from Morocco. And, like, for example, they're very much outspoken about women's genital mutilation. Like now, with all the agitation in Iran against the hijab, one of the is Iranian. She was in prison in Iran for a similar reason. So with that, they're very actively involved. So you have very active ex-Muslims, unlike all the cowardly non-Muslims who don't dare to say anything about Islam. These ex-Muslims do dare to. And now, what should Hindus do in that respect? Well, they can't speak for the ex-Muslims, but you see, and it's not they who have to wage an anti-Islamic campaign, but they can apply what the Constitution so delicately calls the scientific temper. You see, the scientific temper was a term introduced by Nehru as a weapon against Hinduism. You see, he thought, okay, Hindus are superstitious, therefore the scientific temper is anti-Hindu, and that's what he wanted. And so you can see that in all the secularist discourse about, rationalism, as they call it in India, which is what they call in America skepticism. This is always against Hindus. You see, this is not against Islam or against Christianity with all these ridiculous, faith healings and other miracles and so on. That's stuff that you could be, scientific temper against. But no, it's always turned against Hinduism. Well, you see, you can apply it seriously. Study what science says about the genesis of Islam, for example. What is the nature of the voice that Muhammad heard? I have worked in a psychiatric hospital, and I've seen quite a few people hearing voices. Okay. And then you see there are some really interesting new developments by scholars concerning the research on the genesis of Islam. Like you have the German revisionist school, which I must say is also very dissident, very oppositional in Europe itself. You see, I was at the Orientalist conference in Berlin last September, and one of the great, proud achievements of German scholarship the last decade is precisely this revisionist school. Now there, you see, in the lectures given, and also even in all the books in the bookstores, you would never deduce that there exists such a thing as this Islamic revisionism. I've seen only one book where there were two sentences in the introduction. One mentions the existence of a revisionist school, and the next sentence dismisses it as fringe and ridiculous and unscientific, blah, blah, blah. And that's all. So you see, this very great achievement is very much boycotted, just the way that everything serious in India has been boycotted by the secularists. Nevertheless, it's very important to get aware of this. At the time in the 90s, Ram Sarup and Sitaram Goel only worked on the problems of Islam in the version of Islam that they knew from Muslim sources. But you see, if you go outside the Muslim sources, if you use your historical sense on the basis of what Byzantine sources, for example, say, what Persian sources say, and so on, you get a whole lot of information that is quite problematic for Islam. I'm going to very, very briefly give two things. One is that Islam grew out of a Christian heresy called non-Trinitarian Christianity, in which they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, he was just a human being, which is exactly the position of Islam. You find it many times in the Quran. And it's based on ultimately an Aramaic text. Aramaic is a kind of related to Hebrew, but also related to Arabic. But so, there are a number of problems with Old Arabic. You know, you have, as you can see in Urdu nowadays, you know, you have these little signs, and then you have dots above and below them. Okay? Now those dots were not written. So you couldn't see the difference between a B, which is a dot below, and an N, which is a dot above, or a I mean, with two dots below, or a T with two dots above, and so on. Or an F with one dot above, or a Q with two dots above, and so on. So you see, the writing system led to lots of mistakes. And so there is a Lebanese scholar working in Germany and working under pseudonym, who had Aramaic as his mother tongue. It's still spoken very minoritarianly, and shows how the Arabic text of the Quran is based on an Aramaic original, but has here and there many serious mistakes. The best known one is the one about the 72 Houris that the jihad warrior will meet in heaven. You see, the 72 women who will be awaiting him. So in some passages, some later passages of the Quran, this is the version. But the original passage in the Quran, where this appears, okay, that's a translation from Aramaic, and the original Aramaic doesn't speak about 72 women, it speaks about white grapes, which is the typical Christian imagery of heaven. Heaven is a cool garden with all the nice things like grapes. And so it's nothing sexual. You see, the Islamic heaven is a big brothel, and you know, Christianity is not like that at all. Anyway, so what you get here, yeah, I'm in a hurry. Okay. Two more points. So what you get here is the inversion of the Islamic story. You see, the Islamic story is first you had God, who had the Quran in his bosom since eternity. Then one day he decides, I'm going to send the Quran down. Then he chooses a prophet, Muhammad, who gets the Quran. Then on that is based the religion Islam, and on that is based the empire, the caliphate. So what happened is exactly the opposite. There was a war between the Byzantine and the Persian Empire. Both used large numbers of Arab mercenaries who fought one another. Okay? Now, one day, the Persian Empire is very much weakened. Its whole western half is controlled by its Arab mercenaries. the Byzantine Empire wins a victory against the Persians, but you see, this is a victory in the periphery, in Armenia, in the mountains, and the whole eastern half of their empire, Syria, Palestine, and so on, Egypt is controlled by the Arab mercenaries. So the Arabs in 622 start an empire of their own. And 622 is the start of the Islamic calendar, which clearly originally was the calendar of the Arab Empire. See, in India too, often the date you get is the date of, you see, the 100th year of the Chola dynasty or so. And so this is a similar system. The calendar starts with the new dynasty. So first we have an empire, then since both the mercenary troops that worked for the Byzantines and the Persians, they were used to the idea that an empire needs to have a state religion, which was Christianity, respectively Zoroastrianism. So they cobbled together a state religion. Now, to make it a really credible religion, it must come from God. So you need a book or revelation, that's the Quran, and to make this revelation really come from God, you need a prophet, who is somehow in touch with, who has a telephone line with heaven. And so that's Muhammad. Okay, so you get a very skeptical version of history. There is another revisionism, ultimately started by a Canadian archaeologist, Dan Gibson, which says that Mecca didn't exist. Okay, Muslims go to Mecca on pilgrimage, but there was nothing there. That for which they go on pilgrimage didn't happen in Mecca. You see, this Dan Gibson shows, okay, in Mecca there's nothing. Like if you do archaeological digging in Mecca, you find nothing. And you had all the opportunity to do it because whenever in an old city some building company starts, planning for some skyscraper, first they have to dig a big hole, and then they start laying the foundations and all the rest. Now, when digging that big hole, they find things. And so it's not methodologically really correct, archaeological layers and so on, but at least they find things, and archaeologists are very interested. So they flock there. Now, they have also flocked to Mecca, and they have asked, what have you dug up? Well, nothing. There was just nothing there. By contrast, the city of Petra in Jordan, now that satisfies the Quranic description of the landscape of Mecca. And there you can identify the house of Khadija, Muhammad's wife, and the cave where he had his first revelation, and so on. So you see, this means that the Muslims are badly mistaken, even about the place of their pilgrimage. Indeed, in the old mosques, the direction of prayer is towards Petra, which was later admitted by some Muslims saying, it was to Jerusalem, but it's actually to Petra. And so then after 50 years or so, it changes, then it becomes Mecca, because what happened? In some civil war in the Caliphate, one of the rebelling parties steals the black stone, which was standing in the Kaaba in Petra, and abducted it as far away as possible from the then capital Damascus into the Arabian desert, and there installed it in what was to become Mecca. Right. So you see there, if this percolates into the common consciousness of Muslims, I think that has the potential of uprooting Islam. Because Hinduism is Sanatana Dharma. You see, it exists since time immemorial. It existed before Rama and Krishna. It existed before the Vedas. You see, so there is not much you can do against Hinduism. Maybe you'll have a Hindu sect without Rama. Well, yes, there are Hindu sects that don't, do anything with Rama, and so on. So Hinduism will survive. You can have all the scientific temper you want. A bit of dead wood in Hinduism might, be sacrificed, but on the whole, Hinduism will perfectly survive. By contrast, once you start critically studying Islam or Christianity, they will go. And so with Christianity, this has largely happened. The de-Christianization in Europe is, and that I've witnessed in person. And I myself, of course, am an example. I used to be a Catholic choir boy and everything, and I'm no longer a believer. So that is largely because of the democratization of education, so that many of the critical ideas have become popularized. And so now, nobody believes anymore in the resurrection, for example. And it's a very small minority that still does. So in that sense, I'm rather optimistic for Hinduism, but not because of anything Hindus do. So I absolutely commend the self-organization that the RSS practices. And in the last few weeks, I've been around India giving lectures and so on. At least half the time, my hosts were RSS people. And I'm surprised and amazed and, pleasantly impressed with the efficiency and the reliability of how they organize. So that, Hindus are doing well. However, whatever they do, it's not good enough to prevent India from becoming Pakistan. And yet, I don't think India will become Pakistan. Why? Because, even though Hindus do a few things wrong, so does the enemy. And so, or maybe, I don't know if they do anything wrong, but they're weak. They have their weaknesses. And so, the weakness of Islam as a faith and Christianity as a faith, that will ultimately work against them. Europe has pretty much lost Christianity. Now it is starting in America, which is the last major stronghold. So there too, de-Christianization is going on. And so de-Islamization is slowly, modestly starting in the Muslim world. So that is what is going to save Hinduism. I said perhaps too swiftly that Hindus have no merit in this. Maybe they do, although indirectly.
They do.
Namely, I see all these rishis doing all these yajnas, and nowadays I see all these pujaris doing all these pujas. And even here, I myself have participated in, laying flowers there at the feet of Saraswati and whatever. So there are all these rituals being done with awe, with, veneration for the sacred. And maybe, that sends good vibrations to the gods and to the world, and ultimately that rains down as, Ashirvad, as a benediction. Maybe that's what, creates certain currents in the air that go in favor of Hindu Dharma. Thank you.
क्वेश्चन है सर, किसी को पूछना है कुछ?
The first question is, forget India. In the Europe and in the West, in America, there should be Islamophobia, which is not there at all. On the contrary, we find that all of them, most of the intellectuals there, as mental slaves of Muslims. What is the reason for that? There are so many things wrong in Muslims, Sharia and whatnot, and 4 wives, and so many things. Yet nobody talks against them. Nobody behaves against them. On the contrary, Europe welcomes Muslim immigrants. and causes problems, still they are not ridiculed.
Merkel taking Germany, Merkel taking
सर
refugees in
आपका
Germany.
Yeah.
परिचय थोड़ा नाम बता
And Deepak Deshpande.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. So, first, the facts. You think what you hear about the West is about as biased and mistaken as what we in the West hear about India. And so I'd like to disagree with you. Nobody's speaking against Islam. You see, the population, the common population in Europe is absolutely fed up with Islam. And so, you see, when you know some bomb attack happens or some rape happens and so on, and the perpetrators are not mentioned by name, then everybody automatically puts it, Muslims. Just like you Hindus do when you know the same thing happens over here. Like the recent cases of these girls being cut up by their ex-boyfriends who are Muslims. You see, it's hidden, it's obscured who the perpetrators are, but you know they are Muslims, and ultimately it also comes out. So yes, you see, you have an upper layer of politicians and of media controllers who give a very pro-Islamic picture. And that's exactly the same as in India. And like in India, now thanks to the new communication technology, you get an ecosystem where you find the true version. You know, just like here you have, you know, Op India and P-Gurus and the Jaipur dialogues and so on. You have similar online media in the West. And so, you know, the situation is very, very, very similar. So, you know, again, I wouldn't be too pessimistic about the West because forces are coming up that are telling the truth. And in a few countries, they are already in power. Like just recently, we had the elections in Italy, where a rightist coalition has come to power. In Sweden, the main anti-Islamic party is now supporting the government from inside the opposition, but so their vote is necessary, and therefore, you know, the policies of the government are more or less in their line. And then you have countries that are simply holding out, that have never converted to multiculturalism, the Western term for what is really secularism. Notably Poland and Hungary. Denmark also, you see, is a very libertarian country and so on. There's certainly nothing extremist about it, but on Islamic immigration, they're tough already, and even leftist governments. Because after all, there is nothing rightist about being anti-Islam. Indeed, the real rightists up to the mid-90s were pro-Islam. You see, back then you had still rightists who were inheritors of, let's say, the fascist period. And they were often anti-Jewish. And so they supported the Palestinians against Israel and so on. Now you see that has changed in the mid-90s because they saw that Islam was becoming a problem. And that more and more common people were complaining about Islam. And at the same time, this whole, you see, anti-Jewish thing was a thing of the past. It didn't interest anyone anymore. So then you see the rightist parties became anti-Islam, which made the leftist parties become pro-Islam. You see, at the time of the Rushdie affair, 1988-89, all the left intellectuals were standing with Rushdie against the Ayatollahs. Today it would be the reverse. Today someone like Rushdie or like me, for example, would be denounced as Islamophobic and so on, they would stand with the Islamic fanatics. So there you see a change has taken place among the elite, but the converse change has taken place among the common people. And so you see most people are now very conscious of the problem that Islam is. You only have the problem in countries like my own, that exactly the same problem like you have in India, that many people don't really vote their own interest. You see, they have sentimental, historical reasons to vote for Rahul Gandhi or Mamata Banerjee or something, and then they don't follow their own real interests. That problem exists. But you see, as the problem of Islam becomes more pressing, you will have people voting more and more against that.
I'm Ajay Agrawal. I want to know what is the percentage of Europeans getting converted into Muslim community?
Yeah, it happens. I don't know about the percentage. I know in Britain, for example, there are tens of thousands, and it's especially women, namely in the context of a mixed marriage. This is exactly like in India, because within the Muslim community there is a strong Islamic objection against one of their women marrying a non-Muslim man, unless he converts to Islam. So that happens, yes. And it's not only in these interreligious marriages. There are also cases, there are not many, but they're very publicized, of women who become Muslim for a different reason. It is that Islam is a traditional religion, which Christianity is not anymore. You see, in Christianity you had a strong role division. Women were not allowed to become priests. In fact, according to St. Paul, they were not allowed to speak up in public. And St. Paul says very explicitly that, you see, the man is the head of the woman. You see, it's he who, gives orders and she who obeys. The traditional wedding formula, which till recently also counted for civil marriages, that has been changed by law, is that the man promises the woman protection and the woman promises the man obedience. Okay? Now you see, Christianity doesn't dare to impose, to enforce these things anymore. Like the Anglican Church or many Protestant churches have women priests, have women bishops and so on. It's only the Catholic Church there that still holds out, and not very long anymore, I predict. Whereas in Islam, this is totally obvious. Women wear the veil and they have to obey their husband and so on. A man can marry 4 women, whereas a woman can't marry 4 men and so on. This inequality is very obvious. The Quran says it very explicitly that man is superior to woman. And so some women like it like that. And so they convert to Islam because this is the only society where they can still follow the traditional role. Yes? So yeah, I mean there is quite a bit of conversion. There are also a few people who get disillusioned and who come back. That also happens. And so Islam is not strong enough yet in Europe to punish those people. They have to let them go. Whereas strictly speaking, an apostate should be punished by death. Yes.
Firstly, sir, I am really grateful for a time travel, almost 75 to 100 years span. And secondly, I have been listening to our Sunilji Kitkaru as a convener of Bhartiya Vichar Manch for the last 5 years. First time I have listened to him in English. He is speaking very flawlessly. My question is, Sir, when I was a student and studying in Pune University, when this Babri Masjid demolition took place, one of the role models, the so-called role models, were the staunch Hindu fighters like Kalyan Singh, uh, who was giant killer to
Yeah.
take over Uttar Pradesh, and Uma Bharti. And later on, in pursuing this typical secular or soft Hindutva, they were systematically sidelined for political compulsions.
Yeah.
Don't you see, maybe in the current years, when such staunch Hinduism is followed by Modi and Yogi, we are moving towards a better political system?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Modi hasn't, well, no. You see, I have defended Modi in 2002. I co-edited a book about Godra and how and why Modi was innocent. Whereas everybody else said that Modi was really the evil genius behind the riots and stuff. But nevertheless, and he was the Hindu Hridaya of Samrat, remember? And so he was very good in the sense that he didn't bow down, you know. He didn't start saying, oh yeah, Hindus are guilty and Muslims are the good ones and so on. He didn't do that. He refused to wear a skull cap and, you know, other Islamic gestures. So that was nice. But then, you see what few people were aware of is that then he started taking down everything explicitly Hindu while Chief Minister of Gujarat. Like back then, I already heard, you see, the BHP, the Bajrang Dal in Gujarat are being sidelined. Like the firing of this Mr. Togadia. You know, of course there were things to be said against Togadia, I'm aware. But nevertheless, I think it is mainly his pro-Hindu stance that cost him his career in the BJP. So, I wasn't too enthusiastic about Modi. Then again, in 2014, I also saw that for the BJP leadership, he was too Hindu. They wanted to foist on the BJP electorate Rajnath Singh as their prime ministerial candidate, who's an okay fellow, but grey and non-outspoken and secular, you know. And so instead they wanted Modi, and indeed it is all the anti-Modi propaganda by the left that gave Modi his strong pro-Hindu image, which is what the Hindu electorate wanted. So, you see, ever since there has been this strange alliance between the BJP party leadership and the anti-BJP coalition of missionaries, Muslims, Mongolites, and so on. Namely, they both keep up the story that BJP is a fanatically Hindu party, because that's what makes Hindus vote for it. And meanwhile, they have their story about the ugly, vicious Hindu party, you know, so they're both well served by this story, which is not true. You see, now, you see, under Vajpayee, they could still say, yeah, but we're dependent on the Allies, and the Allies don't want it, blah, blah, blah. Though, of course, even then, you could achieve something. Not all you wanted, but more than nothing. Anyway. But so there you could say that under Modi you can't. Modi has a very comfortable majority. And so if he doesn't do anything pro-Hindu, it's because he chooses not to do anything pro-Hindu. In 2018, you had a private bill by Satyapal Singh, one of their members of parliament, to abolish the constitutional discriminations against Hindus. And nobody could have anything against that. You know, you read the text. I also know who has ghostwritten the text. Yeah, Satyapal Singh himself. But So there's absolutely nothing objectionable in it. It doesn't say, because of Hindu Rashtra we have to abolish the anti-Hindu discrimination. No, it says because of equality, because of secularism we have to do this. And obviously it is an implication of secularism that there is no discrimination on the grounds of religion. Okay? So it was an easy thing to do. They didn't have to show any Hindu face, just a normal democratic secular face. It didn't affect the minorities, it would only be good for the majority. And yet it wasn't done. Indeed, worse, you see, the government didn't support the private bill by Satyapal Singh, and it bought off Satyapal Singh, gave him a junior cabinet post, but of the proposal, nothing was heard again. So clearly this was a trade-off. So you see I think that's even worse than a disappointment. Okay? Now, Yogi hasn't done any such thing so far. Not that I know. You see, maybe I don't follow the UP politics close enough. But not that I know. And so I liked him from the beginning. And so I hope he becomes the next prime minister. Him or this Himanta Sharma from Assam. And there must be more people in like the second rank of the party. You see, some people have, you see all this on Twitter nowadays. In the old days, you see, I liked to get the pulse of Hindu society by talking to common people in tea stalls and so on. Now, the thing is that that's not really a context where you can really get what they, in the back of their minds, they really think. Because the personal communication makes people abide by certain rules of politeness and, they don't want to shock you too much and so on. So you don't get to hear what they really think. On Twitter, you see, people are alone behind a computer screen and somehow this seems to, relinquish all their inhibitions and they really speak their mind. And so, you see, there many people say, we need to drop the BJP, we need to found a new party. Now, of course, this is all talk in the couch, because nobody's doing anything in that sense. Although founding a new party is a lot easier today with the new media than it was in the past, but it's still a big job, so nobody's taking it up. I've also suggested to them there is an easier thing you can do, is to found a Hindu lobby that works within the BJP, that can also make demands against other parties. And so this is a familiar thing in politics. Like in the Labour Party in Britain, you had a militant tendency, the Trotskyites, the Trotskyites who conducted a policy of what is called entryism. They entered the Labour Party in order to influence it from within, to push it in a leftward direction. Then in America, in the Republican Party, about 20 or 15 years ago, you had the Tea Party, to push the party in a more conservative direction. That was a bit less successful. But in Congress in the 30s, you had two lobby groups. The Congress Socialist Party, which was very successful in pushing Congress to the left, and the Hindu Mahasabha. Don't forget, the Hindu Mahasabha started as an intra-Congress lobby group, which, by the way, is interesting to know. If the communists keep saying, you see, the Hindus were not with the freedom movement. No, the Hindu Mahasabha was absolutely part of the freedom movement. Okay? But so they worked within Congress. At some point, they were so successful that Congress started to do something against it. And so there you had the same double membership issue that you had in 1979. And so people were forced to choose, either you remain in Congress or you remain in the Hindu Mahasabha, which, on the first, Rajendra Prasad is an example, which did his career a lot of good, he became president. Of the other, you had, for instance, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, founder of BHP. But so this is a thing you can do. You can start an intra-BJP lobby. Now nobody does. Hindus love wailing. Oh, they're so good at it. But you see, following it up with action, I'm afraid not. But what you can still hope for is that without any formal structure of such a lobby group, some people simply are wedded to Hindu ideals and they can somehow rise to the top and then, steer the BJP back in a Hindu direction. And so with people like this Sharma in Assam or this Yogi in UP, I remain hopeful that this may happen. There's nothing I can do to make it happen, but it may happen. Yes?
Last question.
I am Nitin Mohri. What are your views on the Dalit movement in India vis-a-vis their alignment with Muslims, fanatic Muslims?
Well, all the Western India watchers, of course, and also in India, all the sociologists and such, all the leftists, try to propagate this idea of a Dalit Muslim alliance. The beam and in the reality there isn't much of that because the enmity between the two groups is so strong. And so you see, nowadays there aren't many Hindu Muslim rabbis anymore, but when they were there, they were mostly Muslim Dalit rabbis. And you see, Dalits are strong. I mean, when I hear Hindus wailing about how weak Hindus are, that may count for the upper castes, but you see, the Dalits are strong and have a strong sense of communal identity. Now, of course, within the Dalit movement, you have a large anti-Hindu animus, which is not the same, but runs parallel to the anti-Hindu animus in the Muslim community. And you have an anti-Hindu animus amongst the Hindu-born secularists, and you have one among the Christians. And so they run parallel, they have the same goal, but they have their own separate identity. What is good about the Dalit movement? Well, some of their demands, some of them have been realized by now, are in essence good. I mean, you see here on caste I rarely speak because I understand that, you see, this is an issue among Hindus that I don't really understand. Like I know that reformists also have a bit of casteism in them. Like I remember the scene when the grandson of Sitaram Goel, who was a very strong reformist and anti-caste, you see, when the university had a lady love and they were going to get married, the family was quite upset. Then it turned out that the girl was also an Agarwal, like they themselves were, and then it was okay. Maybe a love marriage is not deemed as good as an arranged marriage, but okay, if they were the same caste, it didn't matter. And so, that's hard to discard in one generation. That will take time. But so, I don't know, and so in that sense I don't want to judge too strongly. Nevertheless, this whole policy of caste reservations, I don't like it. You see, in my society, you also had inequality, also hereditary inequality. You had the difference between the nobility and the commoners, and then you had de facto inequality between the rich and the poor. All right. Now, that was remedied to a very large extent without reservations. And so I don't think reservations are necessary. And in America, this whole affirmative action and so on, I see it do a lot of harm. So I'm not in favor of it. In India, moreover, you see all these, Brahmins complain, okay, I did my entrance exam and I had 91%, but I didn't get the post because it was given to a Dalit who had 54%. These things happen and I don't like to see them happen. But it goes beyond that. You see, it impinges upon the equality before the law. You see, in India you have 3 such cases where the law is by definition unequal. This is between scheduled caste, and scheduled tribes versus all the rest, which is a law voted in somewhere in the 1980s. But confirmed by the BJP in 2016 or so. Then in spousal conflicts, intra-marriage conflicts between husband and wife, you have a strong inequality in the sense that if, let's say, a wife accuses a husband of child abuse, he is automatically treated as guilty. It is he who has to prove his innocence against the fundamental legal principle of the assumption of innocence. The normal law is that you are innocent unless you are proven guilty. And here nobody has to prove his guilt, it is he who has to prove his innocence. And so if your wife accuses you of something, immediately your contact with the children, for instance, is cut. And you are effectively punished regardless of any verdict. So this is inequality in law. It would have happened also if the Congress had remained in power in 2014. Before that they had what is the name of the law? The communal violence bill or something.
Yes.
Where it was assumed that if there is a Hindu-Muslim riot, automatically the Hindus are deemed guilty. Automatically the minorities are deemed the victims. Right? Now that law did not pass. But you see the law with inequality between husband and wife that is in force and is abused a lot. And the Scheduled Tribe Act is also there, and it's also abused a lot. You have a lot of crimes against Brahmins where Dalits are deemed a priori innocent. Now, a lot, it seems a lot to me. I don't know what its percentage is in India and so on. I'm not a legal scholar, but I know it exists and it's incorrect. And so, this happens in the name of progressive principles. Giving a leg up to the ex-oppressed class. But so the effect is very negative. So that I disagree with that, and so on the same grounds I disagree with the principle of reservations. Perhaps it could be tolerated as a temporary thing, but it's proving to be just the opposite. Nobody dares to abolish it, so it keeps growing. Like the Supreme Court has said, it can never be more than 50%. I think in Tamil Nadu it's like 90% or so. Of the nominations or so that are decided by the candidates' caste. So, that's what I think of the Dalit movement. So it is somewhat necessary. One of the first people I personally got to know, who became a friend, was a Dalit who had converted to Catholicism. He was my neighbor in Varanasi. And He was also an activist of the Bahujan Samaj Party. It's thanks to him that I could get an interview with Kanchiram. But he said this conversion is not the solution. He said, you see, the church is just as full of caste as everything else. I feel like a frog who has jumped from one pond into the next that proves to be just as muddy. But so I liked him as a person, and I understand, you see, the suffering that Dalits have gone through. So in that sense, I mean, I am also not one with all these upper caste people, whom you find in large numbers in Hindu activism, who at the same time complain about the reverse discrimination that they are suffering. So I'm against that reverse discrimination. Nevertheless, I think they should heed their words. Like, for instance, around 1990, against the Ayodhya mobilization, the left started a caste mobilization with the Mandal Commission, and so there was a protest against that by upper caste students, and there was one action in, I think, Delhi University, where upper caste students were sweeping the floor and saying, yeah, this is the future that the government has in mind for us and so on. Well, that's not very sensitive. That's a grave insult to the people who actually do use brooms and who do the sweeping, So I mean that upper caste sense of superiority that's real, that has existed. And some of it shades over into the sense of superiority that the communist Brahmins also still have. You see, part of that is due to their caste background. So that also existed. And so I have many friends called Sharma and Tiwari and Ayar and so on. Nevertheless, I also see that there's another side to this. But the last word about it is that here, as a foreigner, I really can't go too deeply into it. You see, there are many Westerns who are gung-ho about, I am against the upper caste and so on. They don't understand what it is all about. Like, for instance, they don't understand that caste, before being excluded from, is first of all belonging to. You see, caste is a solidarity network. In the old days when caste still existed, if you came into a village and you were in trouble and so on, you would ask for help. People would direct you to people of your own caste. You see, over there, you are a Yadav, but over there is a Yadav family, you go there, they will take care of you. And so, in that sense, you see, caste was also a form of social capital, as they call it. You see, before you start talking about the exclusions of caste, which are very much there, you first should see the social reality that caste is a very extended family. And I just mentioned a few of the complications of caste. It's very complicated, and so I only touched the surface. This is an issue that I really leave to you.
Margaret,